Talking about students not doing the reading and talking about students using AI, I'm almost so sick of it because the conversation goes to like bemoaning the students and being like, they don't do this, they don't do this, rather than a focus on how teachers can address the moment. Conversations tend to focus on the student when I think they need to be focused way more on how we address it and still create engaged critical thinking learning environments. Welcome back, everybody. It is your host, Iman, your professor friend who turns to her work and research as a scholar of religion and spirituality to answer both big and small questions about what it means to be human in the everyday world we live in. I'm actually not feeling very grounded in this moment, if I'm being honest, and that is because it is my last day in my summer sublet, and I have to move out tomorrow, and I'm staying with my girlfriend for a bit. I've got my last day in the archives, and I've been in New York doing research in several archives at Columbia and NYU this summer. But the reason why I'm not feeling grounded, despite looking at all of my suitcases around me, is because there are two dogs who live on the bottom floor of this apartment. And this apartment has been so good to me. But these two dogs, they're the little like wiener Dachshund dogs, and they do not stop barking. I love animals. I love dogs. I think these little dogs have such bad anxiety that when the owner is not there, they just constantly bark. So this is a small tangent that I was actually going to open up by saying that I'm finding grounding in my health. I randomly got flu A in the middle of the summer, which is so rare, but I got the flu doing a lot of traveling. And I had mentioned in last episode how I was going to go to Panama to hang out with my friends. And I had just gotten back from Chicago to celebrate my friend who was getting married. And yeah, in the hustle and bustle of that, I got flu A. And I cannot remember a time that I have been sicker. I have never had a fever as high or as long as I did ever before. And it took me out in a way, like I said, it really humbled me. And I was supposed to have Prof in the Park last Thursday, but I truly could not get out of bed. And it was also the Jupiter Cazimi, which is basically when Jupiter as a planet is in its most energetic. And Jupiter is a planet of abundance, and all of the astrology girlies were talking about on this day you want to do a little something that is going to make you have a lot of abundance, or in a space in your life where you want to draw on lots of abundance. And so I was just so excited that Prof in the Park landed on this astrological gold mine of a day. I was like, that's exactly what I want. I want to pour in abundance to ground it in what I am trying to build in terms of gathering people in person to think together, doing this free public lecture, but the universe would not have it. I was deeply humbled. And so we actually are moving Prof in the Park. By the time this comes out, it will have already happened. And so I will just go ahead and thank Allah, the universe, and all of you who showed up for it and have shown your support ahead of it. But all that to say is, despite the dogs barking, I am still finding grounding in my health and finally feeling back to energy. I wouldn't even say I'm fully 100% back to my energy levels. I would say I'm probably 75% there, but it has been a long and windy road back to even just that 75%. So I'm feeling grateful for that. But it is the end of summer and I am getting ready to see some more friends before I head back to Atlanta and start the semester. But that is actually a perfect segue because I am gearing up for my second semester as a full-time professor and my second semester of teaching at Spelman College. And it wasn't until yesterday that I actually read my teaching evaluations. And so for those of you who are not familiar, after you take a college class, let's say you enroll in my class, you're in any professor's class, it actually feels rather disingenuous to say that the professor is the only person doing the evaluating, because at the end of the semester, students fill out teaching evaluations that ask them questions about how their professors taught, how they thought of the classroom experience, what they thought of the reading. If there's one thing that they felt strongly about, what would they change about the class and what have you, and you get a whole ranking system. But all that to say is that students fill out and evaluate us in the same way that we evaluate them. And it's actually really hard to get students to fill out this form and to actually share their thoughts. I had between a 65 and 68 average percentage of people actually submitting their evaluations, which is actually pretty good, but that actually sounds pretty low because it's like, why wouldn't all students do it? But all that to say is I was just sitting down the other day, like, okay, I really need to get my syllabi together. I'm teaching Intro to the Study of Religion and Intro to the Study of Islam. And I was sitting down to get my syllabi together and I was like, oh my God, wait, I have not looked at my course evaluations. And I went and I opened them and I actually learned something. I learned some things that were really surprising. And I wanted to have our grounding question today be going over what did I learn from my course evaluations. As a first time, full-time tenure track professor, my first time having a full course load to teach, what did I learn from my evaluations and what did I learn from my experience? I realized I haven't actually used this space to reflect on that experience and reflect on what I learned in the classroom. And so if there's one thing that I learned, and this isn't even one of the things that I wrote down, it is that teaching is an art. Now, I have a twin sister who teaches teachers. She's a teacher coach, and I won't say who she teaches for, but she teaches for a really big, prestigious teaching organization. And she has like 30 or 40 teachers that she is in charge of coaching. She was a former assistant principal and head of instruction. So all that to say is I have a twin sister who looks exactly like me, who's actually in charge of teaching teachers. And one thing that you would think that we would get a lot of training in grad school, considering that we are signing up to be professors and teachers, is teaching in and of itself and the art of teaching. My twin sister always used to tell me that teaching is an art. It is a practice. It is something you have to get good at. Regardless of your expertise on the subject matter, teaching is an art. And if there's one thing that I kept hearing over and over again this past semester, as I was learning with my students, of course, I knew the subject material, right? I taught 2 classes that were my bread and butter in terms of my expertise. So last semester, I taught Intro to the Study of Religion, which I'm teaching again this fall. And then I also taught Women in Islam. So 2 courses that I feel like that is my bread and butter. But I was still learning with my students because I was learning the culture of the institution. I was learning the student body. All of my previous experiences had been at PWIs or predominantly white institutions. So I'm learning what it means to be at an HBCU. I'm learning at what it means to be at a women's college and just a different kind of like relationship to the classroom or relationship to the institution. And so I was learning with my students and also learning that teaching is an art. And that is one thing that I have learned. But in terms of my evaluation specifically, I did actually really well. I got like way above average of like both my department and my division in terms of like the humanities and the school-wide average. So I did really well. My students really liked the class, and that made me feel really good. I noticed that I only wrote things that I'm going to improve on, but to my credit, I think it's also important that I note things that students said across the board that I thought were really affirming and that I'm going to keep up. They all mentioned that the intellectual environment was really comfortable. They felt really comfortable asking questions and comfortable participating, even when they weren't sure about something or fully grasped it. So I'm counting that as a huge win. They also felt like all of the materials were really well thought out, and that they very clearly saw a connection between all of the materials and the week's themes. I always think it's really funny when students say, and the professor was extremely knowledgeable about the course area, because it's like, that is my job to be knowledgeable about it. But it is nice to know that they felt that way, that they felt that I was knowledgeable. And not only that I was knowledgeable, but then I could teach from a place of knowledge and they got it. In addition to learning that teaching is an art and those positive things, the first thing I was so shocked to find out on the course evaluations was that students wanted way more hands-on activities. I was actually really nervous when I got these classes and I saw, oh my gosh, these are all typically lecture classes. So I spent a good majority of the semester lecturing. And in my previous experience when I taught at Yale, students definitely wanted what people call a sage on stage model. They wanted lectures. They wanted you to tell them what to think. And so that was the kind of student I was used to teaching and being a professor for and teaching religious studies to. So I adopted a similar model in that every day I was basically lecturing. We definitely had a few days where we did reading of primary sources, but let's just say, and this is being generous, that 80% of the class was lecture. I mean, and that's being generous in terms of like on the low side. And then 20% was us doing like reading of primary sources, close reading, watching things in class, having a kind of conversation based off of a visual element. So I was just really surprised because I found that students, when I was at Yale and at predominantly white institutions, it was really hard to get students to participate and to engage with the materials. And immediately within the first 2 weeks at Spelman, I realized that actually student engagement in getting students to participate, answer questions, and what have you, that was a non-issue. I say the biggest thing, whereas when I would ask a question at Yale, for example, I would be so happy if like one person would answer that question or two people would answer that question. Whereas what I realized is that the culture at Spelman was different, where when I would ask a question in class, pretty much every student raised their hand. And if they rose their hand, they also expected that they would talk. So it became way more about managing participation. And I actually really had to change the way I prepared for class because I just had too many lecture slides, not betting on the fact that students would be asking so many questions and want to participate. And I wouldn't just feel like I was kind of moving the train along by myself. They were definitely active participants in the lecture and what have you. So I was still kind of surprised that students said that they wanted way more hands-on activity and way less lecture, even though they said they liked the materials and they felt it was engaging. But yeah, they just wanted less lecture, more hands-on. So that is something I'm going to be changing, is I'm going to try to do way more hands-on, primary source, activity-based learning, which will also be a challenge for me because as most professors do, I think you end up teaching the way that you learn, and I'm an auditory learner. Just based off of purely this podcast and the kind of, lecturing that I do, and that I really like lecture as a model for my self-learning. Like I can be engaged in an hour of lecture and I'm like hanging on to every word. I'm right there with you. I went to a Muslim charter school growing up during like the foundation of my education. And we had a lot of Quran recitation and memorization classes. And that was also I also would learn really well auditory. So then in that case, I just have always found that I really thrive on a lecture style. So that's going to be a challenge for me because I'm an auditory learner. So I like to talk through things and have a lectures-based style kind of conversation, even though I'm always asking questions and bringing students in. But yeah, just knowing that they want way more activity-based things, that is going to be a challenge for me. But one, I'm going to rise to the occasion too, because I want to just be able to have different modes of engagement. Another thing that I learned, and I actually have conflicting feelings about this, and you guys can let me know what you think in the comments, is that students wanted more assignments and more homework assignments so that they didn't feel so much pressure on the final. This was primarily in my Intro to the Study of Religion course, and that was a class where I had them do podcast finals. They had to create podcast episodes where they explained a big idea in religious studies to a case study that they identified themselves. For example, one of my students did a podcast episode on the demonization of African diasporic religions in reactions to sinners, for example. So they use sinners as a case study for exploring what we talked about in the semester, which was the demonization of African diasporic religions or African diasporic traditions. I loved the product that I got out of that final, and I'm going to talk about this in a little bit, but the product that I got out of that final, I thought was so much better than if I had just assigned a regular final paper, because, it's hard to use AI really in a podcast final. Sure, you can use it in some way, and if students do, like whatever, but at the end of the day, having to sit and talk about something and be knowledgeable about it, there requires a kind of critical thinking and grappling that you have to do that I just felt really tested students' ability to think with the big ideas and the theoretical concepts that we talked this semester in a way that I just feel like a final paper where students are using AI on final papers, you can tell, and they're not critically thinking. All that to say is they wanted more assignments because they wanted that final to weigh less, if that makes sense. So the more assignments, the more basically diverse points. They wanted more homework. And I am such an anti-busy work, anti-homework kind of person. A huge thing that people do in college classes now is they do discussion posts where you have to post whether it be an hour or the night before the class, a discussion question that you have based off of your engagement with the reading. And to be honest, it just feels like busy work to me. I've always felt that way. I would say that probably like 70% of college classes in the humanities that are reading based do something like that. I just personally find it's busy work. So I was really surprised that students wanted more of that. But I think the motivation for wanting more of it so that you can feel like the final is less intense, I don't know if I feel the motivation for that, because I think the final should feel intense, and intense in the way in that, like, I think that it should feel high stakes. You should like be trying extra hard and feeling like your grade depends on it. And also too, I love that that an assignment where it was really hard to use AI, they felt that they needed to give a lot of attention to. So that is something that I learned through the course evaluation, is that students want more assignments so that the final grade feels less intense. But I'm actually not sure if I'm going to adjust that. I don't know, because it's not necessarily more assignments so that we can feel like we have a better grasp of the reading. It's like more assignments so that we feel like we can care less about our final. And yeah, I'm not quite sure of the motivation behind that. Though I do think I need, whether it's like a kind of like pop quiz writing something, I do think I want to include an assignment where I'm getting an assessment of students' grasp of the reading and if they're actually doing the reading. Students not doing a reading, as a matter of fact, talking about students not doing the reading and talking about students using AI, I'm almost so sick of it, because I just feel like the conversation goes to like bemoaning the students and being like, they don't do this, they don't do this, rather than a focus on how teachers can address the moment and work around the rampant AI use and try to have different kinds of materials rather than readings so that students are still getting the big idea. So all that to say is I feel like conversations around student reading and AI use tend to focus on the student, when I think they need to be focused way more on not just societal factors, but like how we address it and still create engaged critical thinking learning environments. Let me know what you think. Should I have more assignments so that the final feels less intense? And it wasn't just the final, like a part of the final was them having a midterm outline for their podcast. And they also had an in-class workshop. So all that to say is there was a bunch of grades building up to actually the final grade. They got 2 rounds of feedback from me and 1 round of feedback from their peers before they submitted the final assignment. So there was all of this opportunity for engagement and improvement. And I really do feel like students really benefited from that engagement. Another thing that I learned, and this is actually we touched on this, is that the podcast final really did work. Students said that they really liked the assignments. They weren't necessarily specific on which assignments that they liked, but they all felt that they were like necessary and related to the reading. And I do think that the podcast assignment worked because of, and this is me going not necessarily off of the course evaluations, but also the grades and the final product. The podcast final worked. It was not students regurgitating AI boilerplate information. It was them critically thinking with their co-hosts, who were their peers in class, and just the quality of product that I got from a non-writing based final, even though there was a written component because they had to turn in an outline, I just thought was so good. I thought it was excellent. That really worked and is actually something that I plan to replicate in other classes. I don't know if my Intro to Islam class is the right class to do this kind of podcasting format, but I'm going to be using it in the future, and I'm going to keep replicating it in my Intro to the Study of Religion because I just feel like it worked so well. Another thing that I learned is that students felt I could have been more gracious with my attendance policy. My attendance policy was that students got 2 no questions asked absences, and then from then on, it would deduct from your grade. Now, when I actually sat down and did the grading, did the 2 no questions asked change to 3.5 no questions asked? Yes, it did. So I was gracious, but I wasn't explicit on that graciousness. I did it on the back end. And I got a couple comments that they wanted less dense readings in terms of things that felt a little bit more intro. And I have 2 thoughts on that. The first being is something that I learned from my teacher sister twin, who always says that you have to have high expectations for students because students meet expectations. The higher the expectations, the more students are going to reach them. So I am thinking to myself that if I have high expectations for participation, then I think students can reach it. And I think it sets an important standard. I actually wanted to hold my feedback for myself this semester was actually holding myself to a higher expectation in terms of being vocal about lateness. That was one thing that I believe I set a bad precedent for as a first time, like full time professor, where in the beginning, students would come in egregiously late and I didn't say anything. And I think it set a precedent that I didn't say anything. So therefore, they could be off the hook. And I regret that deeply because then it became an issue for the semester in both of my classes. So actually, my feedback for myself was that I'm going to be more vocal about attendance, also including being on time. I'm not sure what I'm going to do, but what I know for certain is that I can't just let it fly. And I think I'm still going to keep the 2 questions asked because at the end of the day, you have to come to class and participation is such a huge part of the grade. While I'm going to adjust 1 or 2 readings, I actually feel like the readings that I picked were pretty standard intro level. And I think that there's a common misconception that professors assign readings and the hard readings and the dense readings, thinking that students are going to get them, when the reality is that students get 100% of them. Maybe they even just get one thing, one term, and they can just spend some time chewing on it. It's just the very act of trying to grapple with the big idea and wrangle in what the author is trying to say. That act in and of itself is teaching you something, whether or not you actually grasp the material in and of itself. For me, I always feel like the point of my job as a professor is to teach you the thing in the reading that might have been too hard for you to get. Because let's be fair, like some things are written in ways that are just intentionally obtuse or don't need to be written like that. That is like, hello, academia. But I feel like it's my job to assign you the hard reading while also being so explicit of what I wanted you to learn and get out of that reading. So all that to say is I think I'm going to keep my high standards for participation. And I think I'm going to keep my high standards on having a few dense readings in there in my intro class because I think it sets the bar high. There was this article that came out and it was in The Atlantic and the title was Rage Baiting and the title was Why I Stopped Meeting Students Where They're At. And it was an op-ed written by an English professor who said, even though, we all see the reports that students aren't reading, I still assign the full novel. Okay, great. That's an English class for sure. So he's still assigning the full novel. But the thing is, he actually was meeting students where they're at. Rather than them doing a take-home final paper with AI, he was having them do in-class writing. So he was still meeting students where they were at, not by reducing expectation, but by adapting assignments and adapting the kind of learning environment. So that's still meeting students where they're at. I understand like clickbait and what have you. But all that to say is I feel the same way. Like I'm still going to assign the hard material and have the standard high. But is my portion in my assessments going to be different? Yes. Am I going to spend a little bit more time parsing out and a little bit more time lecturing at you and talking at you so that you can get the big idea and then we go into a small group rather than necessarily jumping immediately into a seminar style? Yes. That's still me meeting students where they're at while not lowering the expectation. And I feel like so much of the conversation around teaching is about lowering expectation and reducing page count when it could be keeping the page count, keeping the hard reading, but doing more lecturing on the front end, which is more work for professors, changing the kinds of assessments and what have you. So this is where my brain is at right now in terms of preparing for the next semester. And because actually, guys, when I tell you I have had teaching evaluations, so when you're a teaching fellow or a TA, you also get teaching evaluations for classes that are not even of your own design. Course evaluations are such tools of sexism and anti-Blackness and misogynoir against Black women professors. And any professor will tell you this. A course evaluation can be a real tool of violence because the way that students evaluate you when you are a woman of color and a Black woman versus how they evaluate white male professors is so they will comment on your dress. They will constantly challenge your expertise. They will comment on how you made them feel rather than what you taught them. There's so many things. And I have had some rough ones at the predominantly white institutions that I've been at that have been just so blatantly racist, so blatantly discriminatory against me. So just to have a really positive teaching evaluation experience where I'm like, wait, this was like really constructive to my learning, and or this was really constructive to how I think about student learning and what have you. It just felt like such a positive experience. So I'm actually leaving this conversation. Oh gosh, I could get a little teary-eyed. I'm actually leaving this conversation and this reflection actually feeling how good it feels to have had a really good teaching experience. A challenging one at times for sure and learning, but like all in all, just a really positive experience. And when I got this job and I was really excited to be at a women's college and really excited to be at an HBCU, I told myself, wow, I just can't wait to have positive teaching experiences to like really enjoy teaching. And I can say I really did enjoy teaching. I enjoyed teaching my classes. Some days are you just tired? Like some days do you really not want to be there? Yes, but like the majority of the days I still knew that this is where I wanted to be. And I still wanted to show up as best as I could. I came to this job wanting positive teaching experiences. And I feel like for the first time having an experience where I look at a course evaluation and I don't feel slighted or that somebody has discriminated against me or just like angry at feeling like I wasn't actually evaluated on my job, on my expertise, on my teaching. It just feels so good to have not have that experience and for it to be so much more positive than it was. So I am just feeling really grounded in that. And I'm going to leave it there. I can't wait to see you next week. You can, of course, always follow me at Iman ABDK, IMAN ABDK on Instagram, on YouTube, on social media. You can also email me a question if you have a listener question at groundedwithdriman@gmail.com. And I will see you guys here next week.